New France, Cornerstone of the Seigneurial Society. Chapter 4 of The Rise and Fall of the Plantation South by Raimondo Luraghi. Although in many parts of Latin America the seigneurial regime had begun to grow in the first years of the 16th century, and in the Spanish Caribbean it was discernible already at the end of the 15th, seigneurial America reached its peak only in the 17th and 18th centuries. However different the external conditions, both Americas, from French Canada down to Spanish South America, showed striking structural similarities. The exceptions were New England and the so-called Middle Colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, which were bourgeois and capitalist. Everywhere the foundation of society was agriculture, mainly based on large-scale land property. Everywhere a distinctive single crop or single staple economy prevailed. Furs in French Canada, tobacco, rice, and indigo in the southern English colonies, sugar in the Caribbean and in Brazil. Everywhere, with the exception of French Canada, where later we will see the exception that confirms the rule, slavery was the dominant labor system. Everywhere the social body was ruled by a particular class, agricultural, paternalistic, more similar in its social connotations to European nobility than to the bourgeoisie, with whom, indeed, it had nothing in common. Recently, two distinguished authors, Robert W. Fogel and Stanley Ingerman, in their much-discussed book, Time on the Cross, have tried to describe what they call the economics of slavery by means of an econometric analysis. They reach the somewhat surprising conclusion that the slaveholding class was simply capitalistic. I have no intention here of entering the polemic or squabble over that work. It has indeed been completely and carefully criticized by many writers who have clearly shown the inconsistency of developing a new historiography by making absolute what amounts simply to a new and not so new heuristic tool. They have questioned the incongruity of jumping from doubtful and clearly partial findings to what are, in some cases, hasty and arbitrary conclusions that are in no way supported by the data. And the feebleness of these very data cannot sustain close mathematical scrutiny. However, 2 points need to be stressed here. First of all, slavery is, in itself, an abstraction. There is no such thing as slavery, there are only slave societies, which means that slavery cannot be isolated from the whole context of the society and class relations to which it belongs. Such societies must be considered throughout the space and time dimensions. In other words, is there a similarity between slave societies, if any existed, in the ancient and in the New World? Is there any similarity between contemporaneous slave societies in Africa and the Americas? Without trying to analyze this question, a sound study of any given slave society is utterly impossible. More than 100 years ago, Hegel cogently demonstrated the absurdity of pretending to isolate the individual personality from the social one and social dimensions from their historic background. The second observation is that the authors of Time on the Cross, who are speaking only of slavery in the southern United States, and should have said so, seem guilty of a second arbitrary reduction when they speak of the South. They intend really to confront only a fragment of its history, including a few score years immediately prior to the Civil War, the so-called Cotton Era of the South. This is, as we shall see, the most important point, as here the authors try to demonstrate the assumed capitalist character of Southern planters. Let us put aside the clumsy and awkward argument that Southerners were capitalists because they made money. If any society able to produce a surplus should be considered capitalistic, capitalism would begin in the Stone Age and become truly the Hegelian night where any cow looks dark. But as history should contrive to classify and not to obscure, this argument should be set aside as useless and harmful. Slavery was introduced into the Americas by capitalism. Mercantile capitalism was the powerful engine that propelled Europe toward America. Capitalistic interests backed the enterprise of Columbus, which, as noted earlier, had been financed by three major Genoese banks. Capitalism opened the European markets to Canadian furs, Brazilian and Caribbean sugar, and Virginia's tobacco. Capitalism was the prime engine that built up a major network of colonies, naval bases, trading interests. But no capitalist class was yet in power in Europe to spearhead the expansionist movement, to build up colonial empires, to defend, administer, and govern them. The bourgeois class had to rely on the old-fashioned institutions that had been born in the feudal Middle Ages: absolute monarchies, military aristocracies, universal churches. These were the builders of the political, military, and ideological framework of American empires, those which gave them their characteristic seigneurial ruling class, with the only exception, as already noted, the bourgeois colonies founded by English Puritans and Dutch Calvinists. Slavery quickly became the solution for exploiting such enormous territories. It even fit well with the old-fashioned agricultural minds of local seigneurs, and the slave trade soon opened to bourgeois classes prospects of tremendous profits. One has only to peruse the documents collected and edited by Elizabeth Donnan to be persuaded that the slave trade, not slavery, was what primarily interested bourgeois capitalists. Soon, Portuguese, English, Dutch, and French slavers inundated the Americas with black Africans, far surpassing the real needs of local planters, who even tried to stop this uninterrupted flow of blacks, but to no avail. Certainly, seigneurs needed slaves in order to have cheap, well-disciplined workers. Slavery even suited the individual frame of mind, which was paternalistic and authoritarian. Add that this was the only way to exploit large landholdings throughout the New World. Agrarian capitalism based on wage laborers and a heavy investment on agricultural machines was yet to be born. It comes usually only after industrial capitalism, when huge development of a sophisticated technology permits major investments of capital per acre, not only in machines but also in fertilizer, canals, drainage, and skilled labor similar to the industrial kind. All over the world, the capitalist classes were fighting for power. The English, American, and French revolutions would finally bring them to the helm. They would no longer need any further support from old-fashioned medieval classes, which instead they would sweep away by blood and iron. The bourgeois historian Francis Parkman appropriately described the struggle between England and New England on one hand, and France and New France on the other, as the struggle of modern society against the Middle Ages. The French-American seigneurial society was defeated, the first to succumb to the blows of the new, powerful capitalist society. Then, however, the winners found next door other old-fashioned seigneurial societies, those founded upon slavery. Capitalism had been instrumental in introducing slavery into the Americas. There, as Eugene D. Genovese adroitly pointed out, slavery had become the base on which had been built a powerful seigneurial system. And now capitalism was finding such societies its neighbors. History plays such tricks on men. However powerful and complex, however widespread and developed, slave societies were still helplessly dependent on capitalism. Since approximately AD 1000, when it had been born in northern Italian towns, capitalism had been building a worldwide network of trade interests, a general regulator of economy and prices, the world market. Through it, capitalism economically dominated the whole earth. Very few, if any, societies were able to escape the iron laws of the capitalist world market. It fast reduced any backward agricultural society to a colonial or quasi-colonial status of dependency. Such societies were superficially free to decide their own economic policies, but as a matter of fact, they were actually compelled to submit to the demands of the capitalist world market. In this way, any semi-colonial country was forced into a single crop status. A diversification of cultures, which is the basis of independence, because it affords the possibility of resisting pressures from outside, even blockades, was all but impossible. The mother country supplied all other products. All the land not involved in single crop agriculture was doomed to produce no profit, since the world market, which avidly absorbed the single staple, was all but closed to any other product. The defense of their interests forced planters, fazendieros, hacendados, and gentilshommes to yield. And what was more important, the capitalist world market not only imposed single crop status, it even dictated what kind of staple had to be produced. Near the end of the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution in England created an immense demand for cotton. This, not the invention of the cotton gin, was the true cause that transformed the Lower South and part of Brazil into the Cotton Kingdom. The demand from the world market was so pressing that had Eli Whitney been unable to invent the gin, somebody else would have done so. The need creates the organ. Consequently, before the Civil War, the South felt the effect of a clear economic trend in the world market that was setting a high premium on cotton. While it is almost impossible to speculate on how long the situation would have continued without the Civil War, it is to be emphasized here that to judge Southern economics by a particular combination of circumstances, which in all lasted not more than 30 years, out of 250 of the life of the Old South, seems a strange way indeed to attempt to understand the nature of a given society. The plantation system was backward. No witness ever doubted that this was the case. Its productivity was not high, and its efficiency was, at best, doubtful. Today, Kuwait may well have the highest per capita income in the world. Does this reflect economic development, efficient Kuwaitian labor, or world demand for oil, coupled with a producer's near monopoly, as in the case of the Cotton South? Speaking of another remarkable seigneurial society, New France, William J. Eccles wrote, "The tendency to pass judgment on a country, colony, or society in purely economic terms can lead to bizarre conclusions. In Canada, when wheat production fell off and food had to be imported, a sharp increase in shipping resulted. Conversely, crop failures in France caused an increase of shipping from Canada to the other colonies. Thus, had there been more frequent crop failures in the empire, the volume of shipping would have been greater, and economic activity would have appeared more flourishing. These dubious economic statistics are a poor measure of the quality of life." In the 17th and 18th centuries, no Cotton South existed. However, the Southern seigneurial society was there, fully developed and adult. Let us try to analyze it more closely, setting it against the framework of the New World's seigneurial societies of the same era. The starting point has to be the Weltanschauung of the seigneurial class. As Eugene de Genovese remarked, an ideological and psychological assessment of the Southern slaveholders is essential to an understanding of Southern political economy. To begin with, the seigneurial system was by no means based everywhere upon slavery. In part of Mexico, for instance, even in parts of the so-called Spanish Main, Negro slavery was more limited. Indian peons were good surrogates for African slaves. Equally, a close study of the habits, ideology, tastes, etc. of Spanish-American hacendados shows them to have been very close to Southern planters and Brazilian fazendeiros. Economically, too, The machinery of haciendas was akin to those of plantations, a subject that will be pursued later. An inquiry into the seigneurial classes should begin with New France. Close scrutiny reveals it to have been the true cradle and cornerstone of this type of society. In French Canada, slavery was a very limited phenomenon, even if, contrary to what is usually assumed, Canada did have several thousand slaves. In spite of this limited presence of slavery, Canadian society was totally seigneurial. Indeed, it is from French Canada that the adjective comes. It was in Canada that the failure to impose a wholly feudal society gave birth to the seigneurial compromise, with a character similar to those of Virginia, Brazil, the Caribbean, and most parts of the rest of Latin America. In 1541, Francis I of France granted to the newly appointed Lieutenant General of La Nouvelle France, Jean-François de la Roque de Roberval, the right of distributing fiefs. In a few decades, fiefs grew up all over the land. However, the feudal regime of New France soon showed a character of its own, a character not to be found in the Old World. Consequently, the name feudal early appeared improper to describe it. The seigneur had no responsibility for armed defense, which the general government kept in its hands. He could not interfere with the traffic over the great waterway of the St. Lawrence, and his powers of justice were soon limited to petty cases. More important, he had no serfs. His censitaires, the so-called habitans, enjoyed a standard of personal freedom unknown in France, as they were not bound to the land or to their seigneur, and were free to move to another place. Moreover, some of the most prominent seigneurial families were not nobles, which would have been inconceivable in France under the old regime. This freedom of the Canadian habitans seems very opposite to the slavery existing in the other seigneurial countries of America. Still, the study and understanding of New France is the key to understanding any seigneurial society. The very magnitude and importance of slavery has obliterated, in many a historian's mind, the bare fact that everywhere slavery came after. Plantations were born with little or no slavery, and the seigneurial classes were almost adult when slavery was introduced. In Canada, this never happened, because the basic staple, furs, did not require slavery. The main task of the habitans being to till the land for their own and their seigneurs' subsistence. Then both seigneurs and habitans, these last under the name of engagés, dedicated themselves to fur trade with the great Indian nations living in New France. By an express act, Louis XIV authorized noblemen residing in Canada to engage in trade, which was strictly forbidden in their home country. This contributed greatly to the involvement of the seigneurial class as business entrepreneurs, thus making its members different from members of the European feudal class, a fact that, up to today, has misled historians into mistaking them for capitalists. Instead, as William J. Eccles pointed out, the profits of fur trade were spent more on conspicuous consumption, lavish hospitality after the manner of the nobility, than they were invested in other economic endeavors. Social life in New France among the military fur trading elite was thereby rendered urbane and agreeable, but the economy remained fragile. Add to this that members of the bourgeoisie who owned seigneuries were soon ennobled. Seigneurs very early built stately manor houses, still to be admired along the majestic St. Lawrence where they lived a completely agrarian and patriarchal life, surrounded by their fields, mill, farmhouses of censitaires and habitans, frequently even huts of friendly Indians, and a chapel with a priest to celebrate Mass. In his manorial house, the seigneur lived as magnificently as his wealth allowed, and not infrequently more so, he kept a very liberal, permanent open house. He administered the baisse justice, solving small feuds between habitans and even between Indians, who usually called him father, as true members of a family, whose structure and ethics are nowhere to be found in the bourgeois and capitalist world. Power was actually in his hands. Any seigneur had a military rank, down to that of captain, this last being reserved to habitans, whose capitaine de milice had the important task of maintaining the link between local seigneuries and the real intendant in Quebec. So the agrarian community governed itself under the super-paternalism of the king. Seigneurs and habitans used to mix freely with local Indians, giving birth to a large class of métis, or mixed bloods, over whom the seigneur held his paternalistic sway. Strange to say, Canada was caught in the whirlpool of the capitalist world market before the English colonies were. Exploiting the fur trade, the Canadian seigneurs were simply doing what the capitalist market wanted them to do. It was this basic contradiction that undermined the Canadian seigneurial civilization, because the fur trade, which put them on good terms with Huron and Algonquin Indians, was the main cause of the No Quarter War with the Iroquois, which in the long run helped overthrow the seigneurial society. But New France was by no means limited to Canada. Down the Mississippi was that part of La Nouvelle France, whose destiny was to be integrated into the Old South, Arkansas, and the so-called Louisiana. There, too, the social structure, the ideology of the seigneurs, the way of life did not change. But sugar, not fur, was the staple, and as it was to become the future economic base of the colony, plantation slavery was soon introduced, as it was in the French Caribbean. So, Louisiana was, in a sense, the historic link that connected the seigneurial system of early Canada to that of the Old South. However, a close analysis of Canadian land tenure under the seigneurial regime would certainly show a rather close resemblance to the headright system of the Old South, South Carolina being clearly a case in point. Land tenure was the social base of seigneurial status throughout Canada and New France. Despite the fact that the Canadian economy was basically commercial and dependent largely on the fur trade, bourgeois commercial values did not dominate society. Indeed, they were scorned. More than wealth, men wished to bequeath their sons a higher social status and a name distinguished for military valor. It was then a society where agriculture dominated industry, as far as a scale of values was concerned. Industry was always subordinated to agricultural interests and to the will of the agrarian ruling class, who, in the main, considered the fur trade more as an occasion for moving west, hunting, fishing, and living in touch with nature than as a purely commercial venture. It was a sort of martial activity in a society where training for war was the business of every day. Canadian seigneurial society was early defeated and almost swept away. However, a close study of it remains, as mentioned, the royal highway to understanding the intellectual aims and social ideals of the seigneurial class throughout the New World.